Thanks, Giulio, for your short introduction. I'm proud and happy to present today the ninth session of the Digital Week with the topic Smart Mobility Revolution Driven by. My role is moderator, and I will do the Q&A and ask some questions. Lucas and myself, we know each other for a long time. I will tell you later. And the hosting is presented by a new CIS, Smart Mobility Management, taking place here together with Giulio at the Executive School of University St. Gallen. So we founded a new institute. Last time we joined your week, Giulio, this was just a plan. Now it's realized, so it's called the Institute for Mobility. It's all around future mobility. It's a new ecosystem. Mobility as a service is one of the key topics. So that's, let's say, the presenter. Our program will be in 3 slots. So we talk about leadership, entrepreneurship, and operations. We had Lucas joining us in the leadership session. And so it's a kind of, let's say, next level or let's say what happened since then. So you get the latest developments. These are our partners. So we join with London School of Economics and Tongji and a bunch of other partners. That's the start, and that puts me now to Lucas. We met 1996 at BMW. Lucas was inventing the first CD-ROMs, which were really a big innovative thing. And spent there a couple of years, probably until 2000. Then Lucas joined Allianz, which is one of the global players in the insurance sector. Was here also very much involved in the university build-up for Allianz. And a couple of years ago, I guess you will know better, like 8 years ago, he left, and he's now an independent expert, a consultant in different advisory boards. He is one of the initiators of our programs and key lecturers. He's also a lecturer at the NYU University. So he really knows the global picture. He spent a lot of time in Munich, but is now living in London, and is also took a role at Split, which I would ask you shortly to give you the update. So I look forward to your session. I look forward to your questions, which we'll take afterwards. And now I give the screen to Lucas.
My pleasure. So, hi everyone. Let's start with a general question. What is freedom? What does freedom mean in the context of the automobile? What does it mean in the context of mobility? I think for over 100 years, we have, frankly, misdefined freedom. Yes, we always had this idea, wind in our hair, accelerator pedal under our foot, driving on a nice mountain road. And frankly, that's also, Hans-Peter, what we were selling when we were both at BMW, and that's what a lot of the auto industry continues to sell to this day. But I would challenge that notion of freedom, and we'll talk about why throughout the course of this presentation. Because the reality is that we're not driving on nice mountain roads anymore. We are driving in congestion that costs the world economy some 500 billion or so every year. Congestion that if we reduced it, actually, we would be able to increase growth in most developed nations by 1 to 2 percentage points a year. Congestion that creates poor air quality, and congestion that actually kills people every single day. So the freedom that we have promised ourselves through the automobile has actually led to some pretty bad side effects. And just to kind of visualize that a little bit more, and let's talk about emissions specifically. So whereas every other industry has been able to reduce the total greenhouse gas emissions emitted as an industry since the last 30 years, transport, in fact, has continued to increase. Now, why is that? you say, because haven't we decreased the CO2 of the cars that we drive, and haven't we gotten more efficient, et cetera, et cetera? Well, let's face it, transport is a lot more than that. It's the freight that we have, it's the air travel that we do, it's of course the cars that we drive, and all in all, it is an industry that has sadly continued to emit more. And that's a real problem. We could go into significant depth on the impact on cities, including the global health impact, which has a several $100 billion price tag attached to it as well. But time won't allow that for today. I want to focus on another part of the side effects of congestion. And that's kind of our attitude, our approach to combating congestion, because we've gone about it all wrong. There's something, there's this idea of induced demand, which is a fascinating paradox amongst transport planners, because you think that if you have a lot of congestion, well, why can't we just add more, build more roads? And what it leads to is that we have this crazy situation where, for example, in LA, there's more land dedicated to parking, just parking, than the whole island of Manhattan. And to put it into more kind of homely terms, take a look at the houses that we build. We build more space for cars than we do for living, and it gets translated into our cities as well. So we have actually made the car so central to our existence, but I would actually challenge whether or not we need that. And I'll talk about why shortly. And just to show in a different way how frankly perverse this is a drop-off for kids at an American school. Maybe just this morning, maybe a lot of you have dropped off your kids by car. But I happen to remember actually going to school with a bike or walking or a bus. But this picture shows that the priority has been given to really hard. What you can't see in the picture anywhere is a playground. Clearly have misaligned priorities. As this run, it's quite wild because you see a line of cars going all the way down the street. People waiting 20-25 minutes to drop off their kids. It's wild. Think of just the time lost on something like this. So what we've done is we've built entire industries around the car. Tires and insurance. Well, heck, I worked in the insurance industry for 11 years. I should be thankful and grateful. But guess what? There's plenty of reasons that we need to question that. We've created motorsport. We've created filling stations. We've geared everything towards either buying, renting, sharing a car. Well, as long as we're driving it, as long as we have it, right? Entire industry is built around the car. And just to be clear, it's not minor industries. That if we start from the beginning of the process with first and second tier providers, then go to the car manufacturers, the dealerships, fleet management, and then ultimately the end user of the vehicle. This automotive value chain is valued at about $2 trillion globally, depending on what you put into it or not. So yeah, it's very significant to our world economy. But is it still significant to us as users, as customers? Because I come back to the question, what is freedom? Do we really want a car, or do we just want mobility? Do we just want to get around? What if the car isn't freedom, but being car free is freedom? We've gotten to that point already, because the most powerful mobility instrument is already today no longer the steering wheel. The most powerful mobility instrument is the smartphone, where you have constant and permanent access to mobility without the hassle of car ownership. So we're on a matrix, we're going from an owned world to a shared world, where sometime in the past I associated freedom with owning a car, driving it myself. Today, much more, I say, hey, listen, I don't own a car. I use car sharing, I use bike sharing, I use scooters, I use hailing. That is the shared world that is available to us already, in particular in cities. Now, there's another dimension to this mobility experience, and that's autonomous. Now, maybe if you still want to own a car, it will be autonomous. In other words, I own a car and it drives me. But the reality is, in any matrix like this, where we're really getting to is the top right corner, where I don't own a car, I don't drive a car, and I'm able to rely fully on driverless mobility as a service. Now, what that does from an industry point of view is it completely changes, obviously, the business models behind it. I'll get to that, but it also changes, for example, the form factors that we build. If the vehicle is no longer geared towards a driver and frankly also crashes, then we can change the form factors. And in fact, a good friend of mine, Sven at Next Future Transportation, he has compiled over 75 different autonomous shuttles, some of which maybe you've seen them in cities around you. I know there's a couple of pilots in Switzerland, there's pilots in Germany as well, and pilots being done by different companies all over the world, in fact. There are quite a few of them, and the beauty of this is that it completely changes the paradigm of how people go from A to B. Now, getting to the business models around it. So my consulting company has a database of about 900 companies that are involved in the shared and autonomous business. And it goes across a new value chain, which I'll share with you shortly. This in total makes up about just under $1 trillion over the next 8 or 9 years. And let me just take you through. If you as a consumer use a smartphone to access mobility, you will do it via, in all likelihood, a mobility aggregator. A mobility aggregator is something like, it may be Google Maps, it may be Trafi, it may be Move It, it may be your public transport app, MVG in Munich, but it may also be a completely different app, and I'll share a little bit more about that in just a moment. But that's your access to mobility. Sitting behind those aggregators are mobility operators, and those might include, yes, public transport companies, but they also include the likes of Uber and Lyft and car sharing, whether it's Zipcar or Drive Now or Sixt. It might also include bike share and scooter share companies like Voi and Tier. Even behind these mobility operators sits fleet management. Now, this is oftentimes ignored, but funny enough, people talk about fleets of roaming autonomous vehicles and they completely ignore that fleets themselves need to be managed. So there are companies who actually manage the fleet, whether it's an autonomous vehicle or a two-wheeled vehicle like a bike or a scooter, or indeed a shared mobility. And to be clear, the mobility operator is not necessarily the fleet manager, as we well know, because some of these operators, they simply don't own their own fleets, but they might all need access to it. There's a huge component to this new mobility value chain, and that's systems and data. And that's starting with the notion that all new vehicles will be fully connected by 2025. That's clear. But what do you do with the data that is collected, with the terabytes of data that is collected every single day from an autonomous vehicle or just simply a connected vehicle or a shared vehicle. That data needs to be managed. It also needs to actually move across the pipe. So here we even have telecoms companies involved clearly, because they're a big part of this puzzle, and as is frankly 4G and especially 5G in the rollout. Finally, or not quite finally, but next we have the vehicle manufacturer. Now, what I want to note here is that first, the distance on this value chain between the user, who's on the right-hand side, and the vehicle manufacturer. You have a lot of elements between the user and the manufacturer. But that means that the vehicle manufacturer is not a B2C company. The vehicle manufacturer sells vehicles probably to the fleet manager or the mobility operator. In other words, to put it bluntly, Uber or Ola becomes the biggest customer for Daimler. It may not actually be Uber or Ola. It may actually be the fleet manager who runs the fleets on behalf of the mobility operators. But the end customer is very, very far removed. And frankly, if you're accessing mobility, you really rarely will care what the brand is of the vehicle that you get into. The manufacturer is supplied by tech companies, and these tech companies, whether it's a Google, yes, but it could also be a company like NVIDIA. NVIDIA makes the chips for virtually all autonomous vehicles. Very, very significant, $300 billion company, and it becomes a supplier in its own right, just as in the past the Bosch and the Conti and the ZFs were suppliers. All right, so this is the new mobility value chain. And as I said earlier, it has quite some substantial value associated with it. We have calculated bottom up around 845 billion plus or minus by 2030. That's corroborated by similar studies that have been done by about 3 or 4 other consulting companies who come up with numbers somewhere between 600 billion and 1.5 trillion. It really depends on what you count into this value chain. By our definition, this is the number that we come up with. But what's also interesting, and we could go into significant detail, where is that value being extracted? What countries is that value being extracted? Just for the DACH region, around 113 of the companies in our database are from Germany, 7 are from Austria, 17 from Switzerland, and as you might expect, the technology side and the systems and data side is actually very well represented in Germany, but it's also interesting to note Switzerland on the technology and systems and data side here. All right. I mentioned NVIDIA. Let me just mention a few of the other companies that fall in this value chain, just so you get a picture, because there is not one company who is able effectively to span the entire value chain. There are some companies that are trying. There are some companies that might actually have 2 or 3 or 4 chevrons in this value chain, but having the whole thing is quite a financial burden because of the scale, the sheer size of this industry. So as I mentioned, NVIDIA, but there's next, somewhere between tech and manufacturing, you've got Cruise and Waymo. Cruise is, of course, a company that's been invested into by GM and Honda, and now, as of this week, also Walmart of all investors. But you have companies that build some of the shuttles that I mentioned earlier, such as Navia and EasyMile. Fleet management, you've got familiar companies like Hertz and Avis and perhaps Sixt as well, but you also have companies like Bestmile, whose entire focus is on managing fleets of autonomous vehicles. Mobility operators, the names that you'll be, many of you will be familiar with, and then finally mobility aggregators, and you'll see a couple of names on the slide, and I'll talk more about that shortly. Where actually do some of the manufacturers fall into? They have different ranges of activity. So Daimler actually is fairly broadly set up. They are, of course, a manufacturer. They do have a fleet management arm, and they do have some activity in mobility operations, although I think it's well known at this point that they are seeking to get out of the ride hailing and car sharing side, which has been not very profitable for them. And this is just a question of who are the best owners for mobility operations. It seems that OEMs, classic OEMs, may not be the best owners for mobility operations. Why? Because they're not B2C companies. Again, I repeat this. OEMs are not B2C companies, but frankly, they haven't been before. They've always been wholesalers. They just used to sell to dealerships. Now they're going to sell to mobility operators and fleet management companies. GM is a little bit earlier in the value chain because of their investment into Cruise in particular. So they actually have even go into the technology side of things. Stellantis is fairly narrowly set up on this value chain, the footprint much smaller, as you might expect. Now, on the far right side of the value chain, I have Amazon and Google and Apple as potential mobility aggregators. But there are companies who already aggregate and have included mobility as part of their offers. And it might not be the companies that you expect. And this takes me to what Julio and Hans-Peter were mentioning earlier, my role as COO of Split. Split is a company that enables companies like Trip.com, Booking, or Alipay to integrate mobility into their apps. And let me show you how that works. So if you are using Booking.com, which I'm sure you're familiar with, to book a hotel, if you are using them to book a taxi, you can indeed book a ride hail or a taxi directly from within the Booking app and pay for it in all over the world. And that entire flow and also the supply of vehicles and rides is enabled by Split. Similarly, Alipay, which is an app that has, well, 1.2, 1.3 billion users. Let me repeat that, not millions, 1.3 billion users. Alipay, when you open up the app, you have access to a ride anywhere in the world, over 2,000 cities. Now, Split, as a company, built the entire front end for this Alipay mini program so that an Alipay user, for example, a Chinese tourist who might come to Europe, to North America, Southeast Asia, will be able to access a ride anywhere and pay for it directly out of the app without opening up another app. And this type of integration, in fact, Split has done with dozens and dozens of companies, whether they're, as I mentioned, travel companies such as Booking.com or Trip.com, or wallets, digital payment companies such as Alipay or credit cards. And finally, of course, integrating fully a range of 20 to 30 different suppliers across multiple modes of transport. And this is interesting and key to the future of mobility as a service, because what I like to say is that mobility is like water. It touches all of us and it flows, it should flow freely. And we should have access to mobility and not ownership of a car. That's my kickoff into our discussion so far. And Spita, I really look forward to an active discussion now, and also to all of you who are watching to all and any of your questions. I look forward to it. Let's go.
Thanks, Lucas. As always, I enjoyed your talk, your impulse. We were discussing before a little bit, who drives the mobility revolution, and I would, to start the discussion, I would personally ask you to give an update. So that some brands, some of us might not know, maybe they are hidden champions, they're acting globally, and I would like you or ask you to elaborate on two of those new players. One is Grab, and about their position in the mobility as a service space. And the other one is this Japanese company called Softbank. I think it just helps to round up these questions. What kind of new players are entering the market? And after this, I would open up. We have already some questions. So after this, I open the floor to our guests.
Okay, so let me start with Grab in particular, because there was a recent announcement that might raise some eyebrows and cheers as well. We're in fact quite excited about the prospects that sit behind it. So Grab is a company that started as, broadly speaking, a ride-hailing app, much like an Uber or a Lyft in Southeast Asia. But what they have done is expanded the offer of services within their app. So they offer financial services, they offer food delivery, and a vast array of different services. And they have hundreds of millions of users in Southeast Asia. And the exciting news that they announced this week is that they are going to be listed as a public company on NASDAQ with a valuation of round about $40 billion US. And just to put that in perspective, that's just under the size of a Ford. Probably, I don't know what it is today, but I'm guessing probably higher than someone like a Stellantis. So you can see the massive growth and the massive potential that sits in mobility, the actual management of mobility, but also the development of super apps. In other words, an app with which you can do everything on your phone. So that's Grab. Fascinating company. Recommend people look into Grab. Secondly, Softbank, which many people on this call might recognize is inherently a telecommunications company in Japan, but it is also the single biggest venture investor in the world by a country mile. They have what's called the Vision Fund, and the Vision Fund has very actively invested into, I want to say, almost all notable ride-hailing companies, whether it's a Didi or a Grab or an Uber. So they have a very, very strong footprint in the mobility space as well. But even if you go a little bit to the left on the value chain, they also have investments in autonomous technology. In Germany, they have the Vision Fund, I should say, has an investment in Auto 1, which is on further to the right of on the value chain. So you can see that they have their footprint across multiple levels of this value chain and are a very significant, very, very significant player in the mobility space. And I'm happy and proud to say that both Grab and Softbank are investors in Split.
Okay, so I would ask Tom Perber. So I put you up on stage, I guess. Yeah. Where are you? Perfect. So Tom, you wrote your question about the future of classic car, but just elaborate yourself directly. So I unmute you, and it should now work. If not, I'm just reading your question.
We can read the question.
Everybody.
Volker Bad actually has a question around the
okay.
dealership.
So
yeah.
Okay, so we start with Volker's questions, which is, where do you see the future of the classic car dealership? How should they position themselves? Ask classic dealers.
So for me, the clue is in the name. A dealership deals. Now, it's very tempting to say, well, there's no role for a dealership because why, a dealership sells cars, and if they can't sell cars, well, what is their raison d'etre? But dealerships have the potential to make different types of deals. They could be the ones selling you mobility packages in the same way that you order, data and minutes and call time on your phone. Why wouldn't you go to a dealership and say, listen, I'm going to spend 400 euros a month, not on a car, but I'm going to spend it on 200 kilometers with a ride hail. I'm going to have 1,000 kilometers with car sharing. I'm going to have 20 kilometers with bike share and 20 kilometers with scooters a month, and thereby build yourself a mobility package. So that is one potential role for a dealership. Another role that I could see for dealerships is one that I heard about very recently, is in data. So dealers who currently hand over the keys to your car, when they hand over your mobility package in the future, they could very well become dealers of the data that is gathered from mobility users. So these are two potential routes. And then the third route is, look, there will still be people who buy cars in the same way there are people who have pets or who buy horses and ride horses. It's a hobby much more than a necessity, and somebody needs to tend to those hobbyists.
Perfect. So I now find the new section about Q&A, and I would quote one of Desiderio Guadalupe. I hope I pronounced it right. And the question is, would you agree with me that freedom is the ability to think, create, and do what we want at our time? Just referring to one slide you started with.
I love the very philosophical nature of the question that we have. What is freedom? And if we go into history and philosophical history, of course, there's various definitions. But to think, create, and do what we want at our time, yes, and to be unencumbered by the need or the default of something like a car, and the services that I've described to you that enable us to do exactly that, to not just think and create and do, but also go wherever we want at any time. To me, that is indeed freedom.
Perfect. So I tried to pick up one which refers to it from Raphael Unterberger. In urban area, this might be realistic. However, how shall this be put in place in wide areas which are not urbanized with this density of availability of virtual mobility? So I guess it's about mobility as a service, but probably also an outlook on autonomous or automated mobility.
So I'm really grateful for Raphael's question, because I think it's one of the next major challenges that we have as an industry to take. So a lot of the conversation around smart mobility has focused on the idea of urbanization. And I think it's meanwhile a cliche, and we always talk about the 70% of the people who live in cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want to ignore the people who live outside of cities, in suburbs, but also rural areas. Now, the reason a lot of smart mobility operators have started in cities is very simply a question of critical mass. So if I have a city of 1 million people and 10% of those are prepared to use car car sharing and ride hailing as an alternative to owning their own vehicle, that means I have a critical mass of 100,000 people. And that's enough, let's say, to start any of these services. However, if I'm in a city of 200,000 people, 10%, the 20% is not, the 20,000 is not enough. So the key question is it conceivable that I have a city of 200,000 where half of the people use smart mobility? And if I have that, then by all means, I have exactly the same potential in that much smaller city than I do in the city of a million people. Now, how do I get half of the people in a smaller city of 200,000 or even a village of 20,000 to use alternate modes of mobility? Now, there's a lot of different nudge factors that we can apply, whether that's infrastructural, you know, the price of parking, the availability of parking, the availability of bike lanes and scooter lanes, of pedestrian infrastructure, the taxation that I place on you know, the classic car, if you will. There are other incentives. There's just setting a good example. If the mayor of a small community always permanently, you know, uses a bike or alternate modes rather than a car, I think that is always a motivation. So there's different ways that we can do this, and also, frankly, help motivate the operators to come to the smaller cities, the more regional, or also, dare I say, the more rural areas. But there's also potential such as ride pooling. So one of the issues that public transport operators are faced with is they think in buses, right? So how often do I have to ride a bus to fill a 40-person bus? And if I don't fill it by running it every half hour, then I have to extend it and only run the bus every 1 hour or every 2 hours, because I just can't fill a bus. Now, how absurd is that? Why are we using buses if that's the problem? Can we not use on-demand shuttles and on-demand vans? Now, that's already being done by companies like Moja, companies like Via, who are changing this paradigm of, hey, we have a 40-person bus, what does it take for us to fill it, and how often do we run it in order to fill it, and turn it on its head and say, we're going to be user-driven, we're going to be customer-driven. And the customer says, I'm not going to wait 47 minutes for the next bus to arrive, I'm going to wait 7 minutes for the next van to arrive. So there are, in fact, customer and user-friendly mobility solutions that are appropriate for rural areas as well. I hope, Raphael, that answers the question.
So thank you, Lucas. Two housekeeping things. One is, please vote on your questions. We have a couple of them, I think like 9, so it helps me a little bit to look on your priorities. And Lucas, the question was whether you will have any handout. I guess yes, probably not all slides, but we will have like a short summary afterwards sent to you. So I pick another one. You know, with this freedom, we kicked off discussion, and the one is from Desiderio. No, sorry, we had said another one from Julia Weber. Cars are the opposite of freedom to me. A strong statement. How can we make sure that car.sharing makes only a minor part in the mobility share?
Julia, thank you for the spirit that's inherent in your question. I share the sentiment, although I'm not quite as critical of car sharing. Partially because I'm a heavy user of car sharing myself, but outside of my pure selfish interest here, it's about having a variety of different options and making them easily accessible, very, very transparent, and also easy to pay for, frankly, using a smartphone, and in future maybe just using voice command. Hey Alexa, I need to get to the opera. Please tell me the quickest way. And if then the answer is okay, take a bike to the next train, or take a scooter directly, super. Now, the reason car sharing is still a popular option is because people perceive it to be the fastest option. Now, that's a remnant of our time of using our private cars. We think, oh yeah, I'll just hop in the car. But what we always ignore, and that goes for car sharing as well as the private car, is all the other factors. So whilst the distance from here to the opera or the theater or the hotel or whatever may be a 20-minute drive, it's then another 10 minutes driving around in a circle, finding a parking spot. I think there was a statistic once that 30% of all cars during peak hours in Berlin are actually driving around looking for parking, which is just a mind-blowing blowing number. Even if it's just half that, it's far too many. So I do think car sharing is a part of the puzzle, but we need to create alternatives and make other alternatives highly transparent by showing the total time and the total comfort that we have. So maybe mapping providers will say, hey, it's not 20 minutes to get to the location, but it's 20 plus 10. And then all of a sudden your decision changes because you realize it would have taken me 25 minutes to take a bike instead, and I would have saved the 5 minutes. So it's about transparency of information.
Next question I would follow up with, again from Tom Perber, which gets in the same direction, just focusing on public transport. So the question is, what's your opinion to the challenge of transforming the public transport system, offering mobility like water, like everywhere affordable? And Lucas, I would like you to take your point from your experience in London, which is probably more dynamic than in Switzerland and Germany, and we maybe give us some insights about public transport in other megacities.
Let's start with the word public transport. For me, public transport is anything that transports the public. But for too long, public transport has been just recognized as an operator of buses and trains. Now, if the public transport industry, die Öffis, auf Deutsch, if the public transport industry sees itself as indeed managing everything that transports the public, then all of a sudden they can encompass ride hailing and car sharing and scooter sharing and bike sharing, and in fact, actually, in Switzerland does a much better job of this than any other country in the world, in fairness, because you can in fact order a car sharing that directly at the train station, or a bike share directly at the train station with integrated apps, and I think that's a big step. We're tending towards that direction. In Munich, there's a collaboration between MVG and Trafi. Trafi is, of course, the provider who integrates a lot of different modes. So there's, increasing realization within cities that they need to bring together all the modes. Now, for me, the next step is let's go beyond the cities. Let's also go intercity, because it doesn't really help me if in Munich I have to use the MVG app, and in Stuttgart I have to use a different app, and in Frankfurt I have to use a different app, and then when I go to I don't know, the suburbs of Frankfurt, I'm yet again using a different app. So ultimately I'm left with exactly the same problem that I had before, that I have 10, 15 different apps to use mobility, and at some point it just becomes frankly a pain, and not the simplicity around that I was promised before. So in terms of like water, everywhere affordable, hey, let's integrate mobility fully into other stuff like restaurant booking, or if you book I don't know, your haircut appointment, directly as part of the haircut, say, hey, do you want to be picked up and dropped off before and afterwards? How are you going to get there? When you book an event, when you book a flight, when you book anything, it should be fully integrated that I have the whole value, the whole experience chain built in. And it's not a huge stretch, given that you probably have your calendar on there as well. So why don't we integrate it fully into our calendars as well, that I can just book and have access to mobility easily and simply, and it's paid for directly out of the apps that we already use every single day. That's part, that's the sort of thing that we're working on at Split, and goes towards this promise of mobility being like water. I hope, Tom Perper, that this answers your question.
Thank you, Lucas. So we stay with the discussion. You mentioned the intercity challenge. We have Stephanie Charget with a question. You talk about Alipay and how other mobility aggregators enable car-free mobility all over the world, focusing on cities. In Europe, about 30% right now live in rural areas. How about them? Can mobility as a service truly provide satisfying mobility offers to people living rurally? And I would like you to ask about your definition of satisfying mobility. We discussed this a lot of times. And what about the population living in rural areas? And this might even, maybe change with the new chances of remote working and COVID. So maybe this idea of we all will live in big megacities might also change a little bit.
First of all, to the last thing that you said, Hans-Peter, there have been some headlines about people moving out of big cities such as London and Paris as a result of COVID. In fact, London had, I think, 700,000 people, almost 10%, leave during COVID. But what's interesting is they're not all going to the countryside to become, sheep farmers and winemakers. They're actually, they're actually moving to other cities. So what we have is a distribution between cities and not a distribution away from cities to the countryside. So let's kind of burst that bubble right away. Second of all, those cities in the world that have managed the crisis, frankly, better than a lot of us have in Europe. And with that, I mean cities like Seoul and Singapore, but also Taipei. They have not had the same experience around people moving out. And in fact, it reinforces the need and desire to be in a city if you know that if something happens, you have the best healthcare available to you, which is not often the case in the rural areas. You have the best care for you in many other ways. If you're self-isolating, of course, don't you want food to be delivered to you? You don't have the same access and availability of that in the countryside as well. So in fact, in a pandemic, a city is actually the best and in some cases the safest place to be. And that goes very counter to what a lot of people have thought and believed, certainly in Europe. So I'm a firm believer in cities, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, but we may see a redistribution from larger cities to mid-sized cities as well. So with regards to the other part of Stephanie's question, we did already talk a little bit about rural areas and the critical mass required to enable mobility services, but also those mobility services like Via and Moja that are stepping up to the plate to provide on-demand transportation in let's say more rural parts. Now, is that going to help in a farming community of 500 people? Look, as you know, Hans-Peter, I grew up in a town of 1,000 people in upstate New York. It's going to be quite a ways away until they actually have car sharing offers. Having said that, let me just put a plug in here for farming communities being real pioneers in both sharing and autonomy, because the notion of sharing vehicles has been commonplace for decades. Farmers sharing tractors, combines, things like that has been very, very commonplace. So you could call that peer-to-peer sharing, first of all. And second of all, if you want to know what the company is with the most sold autonomous vehicles, it's John Deere.
Okay.
So, so we have the countryside actually leading in a certain way on things around shared and autonomous.
Perfect. We have 9 minutes left. I got a couple of questions. Please try to be even shorter, Lucas.
Yep.
So one is, like also from Rolf Blaser. What is your prediction for timeline for the model of mobility you have shared? So we have now invented the Lucas model of mobility. I like that one. So any milestones?
We have to take it. We have to take it in pieces, and we have to take it by regions, right? So connected vehicles, all new vehicles connected by 2025. Electrified vehicles, all new vehicles, and this, I know this is challenging. All new vehicles will be electrified, not fully electric, but electrified by 2025. Very bullish. I've said this. I already said this in my book in 2015. I said it was going to happen in 2025, and I still believe it. 30% of new vehicles sold in Europe in Q4 of last year, by the way, were electrified already, which is an increase from 6% in 2018. So we went from 6 to 30% in a 2-year period. Can we get to 80, 90, 100% in the next 4 to 5, 6 years? I think there's potential for that, but that isn't the piece of the puzzle that we were talking about. We were talking about shared and autonomous. Now, autonomous, again, a big reminder that autonomous is not about taking the car that you already own and making it autonomous. That's nice. That's the Tesla model and whatever, but that's not the autonomous we're talking about. It's about being able to call an autonomous shuttle, much like an Uber Pool, a Moyo, or a Via that picks you up. Technically speaking, our hurdle is not the technology. Our hurdle is public acceptance and business models at the moment. So it's already being piloted. It's being used in certain places. It's just a question of, what do you mean by mass adoption? Is mass adoption 2%, 5%, 10%, 50%? And there, I'm going to say anywhere between 2022, 2025, 2030, because there's a lot of puzzle pieces that have to come into place. Thank you for the question, Rolf.
Lucas, you mentioned nudging. You mentioned behavior. So Christoph Ballon is having a question. What's the impact of the political environment to any changes in our behavior? What has to be changed? Maybe referring, to the major election in Paris or the upcoming elections even in Germany. So what's the role of politics and what has to be changed from the political environment?
I'm glad you mentioned Paris, Hans-Peter, because Paris is a wonderful example where the city and the mayor actually has more power than the national government in influencing mobility behaviors and policy. Paris has declared its desire to be a 15-minute city. They have built hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of new scooter and bike lanes. They are making parking difficult. They have closed down a lot of streets, the bank of the Seine, to traffic. So they are effectively and slowly, no, not slowly, quickly making it less and less appealing to own a car. And I do feel that this is a trend across a lot of Europe, that cities are doing much more to accelerate the adoption of new mobility trends than national governments. While at national level we're still talking about Technologie, Offenheit and BS like that. Forgive me. Mayors are acting. Why? Because the mayors actually have the closer link to the end user and to their residents, and they have the responsibility to act on the air quality and congestion concerns that impact their residents. At national level, it's nice to have nudges in the way of taxation, nudges in the way of carbon taxes and things like that, and that will all contribute. But at the moment, more is being done at city level.
Perfect. So one, to close this off, is not the timeline, but what's your proposition if somebody would like to invest in the mobility revolution? What's a good way to invest? To participate in that revolution?
I have to be a little bit careful here because I'm an advisor to a number of companies.
I know.
And also I have been advising one company that has created exchange creatable funds to invest in mobility. So what I can say is that as more and more mobility companies go public, and just in the last 3 to 6 months, a huge number have, the market is becoming much more fluid, much more appealing, because there's just that many more companies to choose from. So there will be not just single companies to invest in, but increasingly more funds that actually cover the entire bandwidth of the publicly traded market.
Okay. We are approaching the end. We have a couple of questions concerning, let's say, transport modes, so other areas, sectors, about carbon-free and different lanes for different cars. We will not have time to cover this today. Giulio, we will probably take part in the next rounds because I think the discussion was great. Connect with Lucas, myself, our institute for any more information or discussion. But I would like to take the final question, Lucas. You talked a lot about this B2C thing, you know, who has the best connection, which will be more important. Assuming that B2C companies which are strong, like Sony, you know, say invented a car, or maybe Apple, what happens to the mobility revolution if one of those two or both enters the game?
So Sony and Apple have certain strengths, USPs, and in fact, Tim Cook at Apple was asked this recently in an interview, and of course, he still dodged the question on whether or not he's going to build a car, and he's right to dodge it because Apple doesn't build the iPhone either. They just design it and they create the experience. They're the integrators of software and hardware and optimize your usership experience. And I think if or when Apple gets into the mobility space, it will be around that and not so much on are they going to build a better car. Sony is ever so slightly different. They're maybe a little bit more hardware focused. And they've of course shown a prototype of a car in the past, and one of the things that we can get from that is that they have a lot of technology that they want to integrate into the cars that others are building as well. Perfect.
So thank you very much for your impulse for the discussion. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, and Giulio. Thank you as well to all of the questions. I can see that a lot of questions have been left unanswered. Please do reach out via LinkedIn, Twitter, the usual channels. Feel free to reach out. It's been a real pleasure, and good luck to everyone as well.
Looking forward to meet you in person here in Munich, where the new AI mobility will take place in September. We have the ITS World Congress in Hamburg, so a lot of things happening in Germany to speed up the necessary mobility revolution. Giulio, thanks for hosting us, and I give the screen to you to end our session up.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. Thank you very much, Lucas. Very insightful session. I knew it was going to be great. I was already waiting for it. I really urge you, our audience, to take a look at what Hans-Peter and Lucas offered. It's pretty new stuff. And for those who don't know, we also have from the University of St. Gallen 2 podcasts focused on mobility, and that go exactly in that direction if you believe the theme is interesting. Just check on my LinkedIn. I have them there too in my featured websites. And in the afternoon, just as a teaser, we are going to have another technology that is like being revolutionized, and that's the health sector. We all turning into cyborgs. We already have our iPhones with us 99% of the time. The next step is implementing that inside us, right? So it's in this direction, really, the future of health. This is what we're going to analyze this afternoon in the last session of the Digital Week. But all of the Digital Week sessions have been recorded, or will be recorded, the last one, and will be available by next week at the most in our website, as well as in the YouTube channel of the Executive School of the University of St. Gallen. Thank you very much, everybody, and I wish you a pleasant weekend. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.